May I please welcome you on behalf of the Institute of Criminology and particularly on behalf of the research centre within the Institute, now called the Justice and Society Research Centre, which hosts these annual lectures. So a very warm welcome to the 25th Bill McWilliams Memorial Probation Lecture. So my name's Lorraine Gelsthorpe, founding director of the Justice and Society Research Centre, formerly the CCGSJ. But since none of us could ever remember what the acronym stood for, and it was difficult to say, we have changed the name. So it gives me very great pleasure to welcome you all, old friends, new friends, family friends, professionals working in the field of criminal justice, and particularly in the area of probation, and a very warm welcome to trainee probation officers too. So the Institute has a very long-standing interest in probation, a continuing interest too in probation and community sanctions. So it's a particular delight each year to host this lecture. It's actually amazing that the lectures have continued into the 25th year from what began as a 5-year initiative started by some of Bill's colleagues, Brenda, his wife, and his family, including sons John and Carl, whom we particularly welcome. I've seen John, I don't know whether Carl is here. Yes, Brenda. Anyway. So Bill McWilliams had a prestigious career as a probation officer, probation practitioner, researcher, and writer. He was a staunch advocate of the need for rigorous evaluation of probation practice and an equally staunch critic of the excesses of the management ideal. The memorial lectures began as an attempt to keep alive his critical spirit, but also to reflect in constructive and forward fashion. The considerable changes regarding probation in recent years make it an imperative to continue the processes of critical reflection. So for a number of years, the lecture moved from institution to institution, but in 2008, the Institute agreed to host the lecture and has been doing so ever since. It's also worth my mentioning that the Institute has also become something of a national repository for archival material from the Association of Chief Officers of Probation, various probation trusts, and from the National Association of Probation Officers, NAPO, too. We're hoping in future years to make the archive more accessible. We certainly want to make it known and used. So a very warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for coming, and over to my colleague Rob Canton to introduce the speaker.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. Perhaps I can add my own welcome. And although we'll be thanking people properly at the end, I don't want to stand up without thanking Cambridge again for its hospitality in allowing us to come here. It's warmly appreciated and never taken for granted. I'll shortly be introducing our guest speaker, but just to give you a sketch for the afternoon, Burke will be presenting the lecture shortly, and then two people, Anne Burrell and Amy Thornton, will be giving their reply, after which the floor will be open and there will be questions, and also questions, we hope, from people who are attending online. So for now, I think, to introduce Lol. There's a lot about Lol that you can read on the website, and there's a list of his publications and so forth. He's got a particular interest in the governance of probation, as well as its management and practice. He's been involved in a number of projects and is currently a co-investigator on a 3-year ESRC research project, which I'm sure he'll be telling us much more about in a moment, which is entitled Rehabilitating Probation. But I want to say a couple of other things about Lol, which you won't find out on the website. Beginning with the fact that for the last few months, whenever Lol and I have corresponded, we have been alternatively cheering or weeping on each other's shoulders at the fortunes of our respective football teams, both of whom were struggling to avoid relegation. Lol is a passionate supporter of Everton, I of Nottingham Forest, and those of you who follow the game will be pleased to know that neither team was relegated at the end. And Lol, if I'm not mistaken, when our teams played each other, they had the discretion and diplomacy to manage a draw on both occasions. So well done to those teams. It also said on the website that it's always been a pleasure to work with Lon and to correspond with him. He's a very genial, affable and approachable guy. And I know that he has that reputation in academic circles. If sometimes governments seem to want people to compete with each other all the time, but Lol is among those people who won't have it in that way and is always keen to work with others and to nurture others, give them opportunities and to share good ideas. And today, when in his lecture, I know that he'll be drawing not only upon his wide experience of practice and management and governance, not only on his intellectual, critical thinking about the work of probation, but also a passionate commitment to probation, what it has been, what it is now, and why it matters. And this makes him a particularly suitable lecturer to follow in that tradition, that legacy of Bill McWilliams, whose commitment to the moral and political significance of probation was perhaps one of the defining characteristics of his life and professional life and work. So Lol, may I invite you, please, Professor Lol Burke, to present the 25th Bill McWilliams Memorial Lecture.
Well, first of all, let me just say thanks to Lorraine and Rob to be introduced by two people who greatly influenced both my work and thinking over many years, as I'm sure they have many people in this room, is a little bit special, and I feel quite touched by that, quite emotional by it. When Rob first contacted me to say that the McWilliams Committee had nominated me to deliver the 25th Bill McWilliams Lecture, my initial reaction was similar to that of Pope Francis when informed of his selection by the head of the papal conclave. His response reportedly was, "May your gods forgive you." I hope you forgive my fumblings and etc. and nervousness today. But it really is a great honour and a privilege to be asked to give this year Bill McWilliams Lecture. And it means a lot to me personally. I only found out recently though, that Bill was born and worked in Liverpool before being seconded to the Home Office Research Unit, where he met Brenda, to work on, at the time it was called the Impact Study, which was a pioneering evaluation of probation and aftercare, as it was called then. So it seems fitting as a Scouser, given the 25th Bill McWilliams Lecture, to therefore pay tribute to a fellow Scouser. Like many in this room, Bill's brilliant scholarship and commitment to public service has been a major influence on me, as I say, throughout my career. In a contribution to Philip Priestley and Maurice Vanston's book, Probation and Politics, I wrote the following. As a young probation practitioner, I was influenced by the quartet of essays written by Bill McWilliams, which explored the history of ideas sustaining the English probation service since its beginnings in the late 19th century. Bill's writings opened my eyes to the fact that probation's contemporary challenges are not simply a result of what's been going on in its immediate past, but are inextricably tied to the choices, tensions, and initiatives that have marked out its history since its formation in the early 20th century. Trying to understand probation is something I've struggled to do as both a practitioner and academic for some nearly 40 years now. I know you wouldn't believe that looking at that. And often feeling at times that I haven't really got much further in many respects. Although I've been fortunate to have some wonderful writing companions, researchers and colleagues along the way. Some of them are here today. They know they are. Others, like the late Paul Senior, are unfortunately not. I particularly want to mention Steve Collins, who isn't here today. Steve's been my mentor, collaborator and friend for some 30 years, and his enduring commitment to probation and fighting for social injustices never ceases to amaze me. I also want to give a mention to Terry Crowley, another long-term supporter of the McWilliams Lectures, who could not be here today also. I first met Terry when I was a young probation officer, and he was the head of the research department in Merseyside Probation Service. Like Bill, Terry was ahead of his time in promoting the need for an evidential base to underpin probation work, and another champion in the fight against social injustice. Through his work at the Whitechapel Centre in Liverpool, which he continued into his 80s, which is a remarkable achievement. It's become customary at the start of the lecture to rightly acknowledge Bill's work, and rightly so. However, I also want to pay tribute to another McWilliams, and that's Brenda, without whom it's unlikely the series would have continued for so long, and whom it's hard to imagine the series without. Brenda is an accomplished academic in her own right, and of course, many years has been managing editor of the Howard Journal, which she served so well. Brenda, as we say in Liverpool, you're an absolute legend. On a personal level, I'd also like to thank Brenda and the McWilliams family for the welcome they have always shown me down the years in my visits to Cambridge. I'm sure, like many of those who have previously delivered this lecture, as I thought about what I was going to say today, I often ask myself that question: what would Bill think? What would he think about what I'm planning to say? And what would he think about recent developments within probation since his passing? I guess he would have been somewhat incredulous regarding the split of probation and subsequent bringing back together. Speculating on what others think can often be a risky business, of course, but as has already been mentioned, in this case, we kind of know what Bill would think, because he provided the salient warning of the rise of technicism, managerialism, and the rampant bureaucracy which has engulfed the service in the last of his seminal quartet of papers entitled Probation, Pragmatism and Policy. In a wonderful tribute to Bill, Mike Nellis spoke of Bill's desire to defend the moral heart of probation supervision, and with the knowledge, responsibility and craft of individual officers themselves, something which I will aspire to do in my talk today, and in doing so, hopefully can do in a small way justice to the traditions and foundations laid down in Bill's work. Much of what I'm presenting today is drawn from data gathered during the first week of interviews with staff in one of the new probation regions in England and Wales, 1 year after unification. Although I also want to reflect on some personal observations from the second round of interviews, which we are currently in the process of completing. Although, a word of caution here, these have not yet been fully analysed by the team yet. These interviews were undertaken as part of the 3-year research programme, as Rob said, funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, which I'm fortunate to be involved in alongside Matthew Millings, Gwen Robinson, Nicola Carr, Harry Anderson and Ellie Surridge, otherwise known as the Dream Team. There are a number of strands to the research which aim to understand the experiences and consequences of unification at both the local, the regional and the national levels, and from a variety of perspectives, including probation staff, senior managers, policymakers, people on probation and external partners. The current research also builds upon an earlier study undertaken by Matthew, Gwen and myself, which examined the experiences of probation staff as they transitioned from public to private sector employment when the CRCs were first established in 2014-15. This early research captured considerable variations in the way that staff made sense of and subsequently adapted to the turbulent field around them. Our current study will hopefully enable us to further develop a more nuanced understanding of how staff deal with continuity and change in an ever-evolving occupational field. There are 5 main work streams within the research project. However, my talk today is based on the experiences of operational staff in our case study area. As I say, 1 year after unification, as we explored their experiences of the transition, particularly in respect of their roles, their identities and their occupational cultures. We're particularly grateful to the regional director and their team who have supported the research and engaged with us in a collaborative and open manner. There might be some tough messages in what I'm about to say today, but this is in no way a reflection on them or their commitment to deliver the best probation service they can in what have undoubtedly been challenging and at times unprecedented circumstances. I'd also like to thank the staff who took time out of their demanding work schedules to engage with the research, and I hope that what I say today can, in a modest way at least, not only give voice to their concerns, but stands as a testimony to their enduring commitment to those they work with. As part of the work stream, the research team conducted around 60 semi-structured interviews with staff across the case study region between April and August 2022. Our case study area includes a number of former MPS regions and CRC organisations, enabling the project to examine the dynamics of merging staff from the former public and private organisations, as well as reflecting the potential diversity of experiences in terms of role, organisational identities and practice cultures. Our case study area is fairly typical of the probation service regions in England and Wales. The case study area is geographically diverse, with major and densely populated metropolitan areas, a smaller series of smaller towns, and much more rural and scarcely populated areas. Our sampling strategy for the first sweep of research involved targeting a representative mix of probation delivery units throughout the region, which enabled a focus on both those offences where where former MPS, where former MPS and CRC staff had been co-located prior to unification, and those where unification involved the creation of newly amalgamated staff teams. Providing assurances of anonymity and confidentiality, we're able to engage directly with staff groups to promote the research. And as you can see from this slide here, our sample was representative of the wider case study region in terms of the balance of particular roles within the organisation. So, for example, 47% of those interviewed were former employees of the CRC, 45% were employed by the MPS, and 9% had joined the organisation since unification. 77% of our sample were female and 23% were male. How long they had worked in the service varied from around 8 months to 40 years, with an average probation career length of around 15.3 years. In terms of organisational roles, 17% were senior managers, 21% were SPOs, 23% were POs, 33% PSOs, and 6% were employed in administrative roles. In the first of the 3 planned rounds of interviews, which will take place over a 3-year period, our questions covered 4 main themes. First, interviews were asked to outline their employment histories within probation and their reaction to the news of unification. Secondly, they were asked to reflect on their experiences since June 2021, the date of unification, to recall any memorable moments or events during and after the unification process, and to tell us about how well they felt unification had been managed and communicated to them. Those interviewed were also asked about the working environment and the general mood among staff in the organisation. And then the final set of questions asked them to outline their hopes and aspirations for the new organisation, about their loyalty and their optimism for the future of the new service. Through their narratives, 3 storylines emerged that I want to discuss today. These are stories of separation and loss, stories of becoming, and stories of belonging. Storylines and the emotions that underpin them are important because they involve active processes of interpretation that help the individual make sense of who and where they are, as well as acting to promote some lines of action whilst inhibiting others. If we look at the first storyline, which unfortunately, top up there, that does say stories of separation and loss. Interestingly, although we did not specifically ask about transforming rehabilitation, It was very much the backstory to our discussions. And in this first wave of interviews, sometimes was very much the front story too. The events leading up to the split and what happened afterwards featured prominently in all the interviews and subsequently shaped many of those interviewed perceptions and experiences of unification. Many of the stories expressed a sense of powerlessness in that Transforming Rehabilitation was viewed as something that had been done to the service against its wishes and without the support of those tasked with implementing the reforms. The collective memory of the split often surfaced in emotive language and hostility towards those they saw as responsible for it. Like all good stories, there was an arts villain, a Dr. Strangelove, a Professor Moriarty, or Lord Voldemort figure, for example, in the form of the former Justice Secretary. As reflected in these words, sorry, I'll go back there, in Jane's words here at the top, which you can see, who said, Chris Grayling, I don't know the man, but he became this really, really hated individual. Because what was the basis of his decision to totally disrupt what felt like a high-achieving organisation? The experience of experiencing TR and having to navigate the organisational changes involved was expressed by some in the language of workplace trauma, that for many spills over into their personal family lives. According to Anna, TR is probably one of the most traumatic things I've had to deal with on a day-to-day basis. We talk to people on probation about adverse childhood experiences and traumatic experiences. I would wholeheartedly say that if you took it in the context of it being in work and you took it home, I'd actually say we've all collectively had a very traumatic experience in work, and it's not being recognised as that. This reflection from Anna would seem to align with the assertion by Samantha Walker, Jill Anderson, and Sharon Beckett that the impact of TR on the working practices within probation represented a pervasive form of systematic workplace harm that had and continues to have an impact on individuals' mental well-being and professional esteem, something which I'll return to a little bit later in this talk. Underpinning these stories of separation, as recounted by our interviewees, was a sense of loss. As George Mayer and myself in our book, Redemption, Rehabilitation and Risk Management, pointed out, loss has perhaps been one of the defining storylines of probation since the erosion of the post-war consensus in the late 20th century. We weren't suggesting the loss of some mythical golden age of probation, but rather the gradual loss of key responsibilities, duties, and influence. However, when I had a look at what we'd written just before this lecture, and in retrospect, I think we probably didn't acknowledge enough the gains of contemporary probation as well. Probation policy and practice, for example, has positively evolved in relation to psychologically informed approaches, the development of strength-based approaches in how it responds to personality or disorder, and has a much clearer understanding of trauma. There's also greater awareness, if somewhat undeveloped, about understanding the contribution that peer support, user participation, and co-production can have in shaping approaches to service design and delivery. I certainly think that there's a much more developed and nuanced understanding of risk and victim awareness than when I was a practitioner. However, both in the previous study that Gwen, Matthew, and myself were involved in, and in the current study, a sense of loss was evident very much in staff reflections. For some staff, reflecting on unification brought back memories of the extent to which TR fractured their prior professional connections and friendships, notwithstanding in many cases attempts to maintain them. Some went further and reflected on how they believed that TR had undermined the credibility of the organisation, particularly in the eyes of sentences, and their fears that the newly constituted Probation Service would merely be a case of importing the chaos from TR, as one experienced SPO put it. At the same time, the transition into the Probation Service also engendered feelings of loss among some former CRC staff. There were many within our former CRC staff sample who reflected positively on their experiences of working in a much smaller organisational structure of a CRC and what they considered to be the greater flexibility, freedom to innovate and more direct access to senior managers that this had afforded. What compounded their sense of loss was not only a concern that the unified service would be subject to even more centralised control, which they associated with the way that the MPS has developed since its creation in 2014, but that the learning and good practices developed by CRCs would be lost in this process, as reflected in the quote from John. I suppose, in one way, the CRCs had some real flexibility and opportunity to be creative. I think that to go just because we're a civil service rammed into a narrow kind of avenue. That created creativity and freedom to experiment. I'd like to think there was still an option to do that, but God knows it will be audited to death. The idea promoted at the time that the unified probation service was a new organisation with a new identity and purpose was also questioned by those staff who would work both in the MPS and the CRC immediately prior to unification. And this was not helped by the demanding timescale for the implementation of unification, as reflected in Patricia's quote, when she says, "I came from the MPS, so when we split, that's the side I was on. So the bits of that I liked, we've kept, and the bits that I don't, we've kept them as well." I feel like we didn't do enough to learn about each other beforehand, both sides, so that we could figure out what were the best parts and amalgamate them together. We've just incorporated everything into the MPS. The quote from Patricia has echoes of Wendy Fitzgibbon's and John Lear's assertion for me that rather than representing the displacement of old style rehabilitation, TR and the organisational structures that it created was in some ways just an extension of the deepening of the previous processes of increasing managerialism and technicalisation that Bill warned of in his work many years ago. Organisational studies suggest that where size and or power differentials between merging entities exist, smaller, weaker organisations are likely to be less dominant in shaping organisational identity after the merger. The draft blueprint for the new organisation arrangements outlined an intention to work to develop a new shared identity and culture among all staff, building on the experiences of those who'd worked in both the MPS and the CRCs previously. However, in terms of its size, the national footprint of the MPS was far bigger than even the largest of the CRCs. So despite an 11th hour decision to shed the MPS label for the new organisation and adopt instead the Probation Service for England and Wales, to emphasise supposedly a fresh start for all, this seems to have done little in our sample to undo an overriding perception of imbalance and inequality, which had already taken hold. As previously mentioned, across our sample of former NPS and CRC staff, we found many practitioners who felt that it was much more accurate to conceptualise unification as an MPS takeover, entailing the absorption of CRC staff within MPS structures. On an operational and practical level, this was routinely identified as problematic, as for many it underplayed the need to work through and reconcile the differences that were integral and designed into the separate organisations formed by TR, as highlighted by Patricia earlier. But perhaps the most profound sense of loss that people felt, though, related to colleagues, often experienced colleagues leaving the service. This loss of staff was by no means unique to our case study area. When the research fieldwork commenced in April 2022, the underlying leaving rate for POs was 8.1%, from 5.7% in 2017, and for PSOs 12.4% in 2022, from 8.1% in 2017. In many cases, respondents felt the reason why their former colleagues had chosen to leave probation was because they were unwilling to engage with another form of programme, or struggled to see themselves and their skills within a reconfigured service, things which they themselves were grappling with. as reflected in Maria's observation that others have just had enough of, the constant pressures of deadlines. I don't feel like I actually do the job I came in to do. My job just seems to be focused on process, on paperwork, on arse covering. That constant fear that if all goes wrong, it's going to land on your doorstep. As previously mentioned, all those who reflected on the departed colleagues understood the reasons why their former colleagues were leaving, as they also had concerns about their own capacity to meet the requirements and demands expected of them. A review of probation workforce data illustrates how valid these real and immediate concerns around staff capacity were. The data captures, among others, that in March 2022, a month before our data collection started, there was a shortfall of 1,762 full-time probation officers. The staff claimed, and the workforce data would seem to support, the upward trajectory of staff leaving the service in place before and beyond the COVID-19 pandemic undermined their belief that the service was losing not only skilled staff, but also their contribution to a sense of culture and values. This added to the sense of a fractured working environment in a workforce that craves stability. The next slide is about stories of becoming. The next storyline we encountered in our interviews was one of becoming, as staff sought to find their place within the newly unified organisation. The vast majority of those interviewed welcomed the decision to unify the probation service, believing that it was the right thing to do. The principle of being a unified service was something that all of them could endorse. However, we know from social identity theory and from research in other fields that when organisations come together, it can be anxiety-inducing, not just because fears of the potential loss of employment as a result of rationalisation, but also because an individual's social identity might be intimately connected with the organisation for which they work or membership of a team within that organisation. Consequently, how individuals experienced and perceived unification and their sense of belonging was shaped by a range of factors, including their personal biographies, their experiences of probation, pre and post unification, and their role within the organisation and the locality in which they worked. Broader economic and social conditions, such as the COVID-19 pandemic and the cost of living crisis, were also identified as significant influences. For most of our respondents, there was no significant catalytic moment that featured in their stories that they could identify to characterise the moving to a unified service. For many, it was merely business as usual, as the date of unification came and went with no significant change. However, this was tinged with the growing realisation that further changes were coming down the line, and they were understandably worried about what this would entail. To some extent, their worries were perfectly understandable. The initial post-unification period, indeed, was one marked by a flurry of intense activity, involving the ending of CRC contracts, conducting staff role evaluations, and then launching the new unified probation service. Many in our sample reflected on an ongoing sense of powerlessness through and beyond unification, whereby they did not feel that they had a voice in the transition to the new organisation. Whilst many respondents noted they were able to discuss concerns with colleagues and immediate line managers, they also reported they felt disconnected from those at the centre, with decisions made and communicated remotely with what they saw as little consideration for the implications of frontline service delivery. This time, it wasn't so much that they were being kept in the dark by the centre. That was very much a criticism that we found in our earlier study. It was just that there was so much of it. Capturing the sense of being overwhelmed by the frequency of communications and directives generated during this time, one practitioner described the messaging being driven from the centre as a noise that I put up with and work with, but at the end of the day, it's just a noise. That most meetings owing to COVID-19 restrictions were taking place virtually also added to the challenge many reported in being able to take time to navigate and digest all of the information being communicated. As captured in the quote by Grace here, that I never get the chance to read anything on there. And Grace is referring to the MS Teams platforms here. As a case manager, you haven't got the time to lift your head to look at anything other than what's in your diary that day. It feels like you're firefighting. Despite, as mentioned earlier, the perception that unification was intuitively the right step for probation to take, many still harboured frustrations with the organisational upheaval that TR reforms had entailed. And as with the TR reform programme, which had been implemented without a sufficient proof of concept pilot, there was a fear that the changes were once again taking place too quickly. What heightened this anxiety was the concern that probation, in common with many other organisations, was having to adapt to the exceptional delivery arrangements required by the COVID-19 pandemic. As reflected in Ian's observation, that I just found it confusing. With reunification in the midst of COVID and working from home, I just think the timing couldn't have been any worse. They rushed the implementation of TR, and predictably, for political reasons, they've rushed in reunification. And I'm living in the ensuing crisis. Underpinning many practitioners' anxieties was a residual fear that the new organisation remained vulnerable to political interference. Concerns regarding the feasibility of delivering unification and repairing the harms caused by TR within the planned timeframe were widespread, and among our interviewees, there was a recognition of the enormity of the challenge in successfully unifying the organisation. The following comment by a senior manager is typical of a number of staff who recalled their initial reaction to the news of unification being one of my overriding thoughts was this is going to be an absolute logistical nightmare to even start unpicking, that referred to TR here, and trying to bring this back together. For a considerable number of those interviewed, the language and processes of unification were believed to have underestimated the profound challenges of bringing staff from different organisations together into a common organisational space. The times that would be required to weave together different cultural legacies was also frequently mentioned. Where practitioners had engaged with the target operating model, as a modest number of our sample had, they spoke positively about the vision for the service and of the phased way the new service sought to evolve. Many, however, also reflected that the reality of bringing together staff groups where some colleagues had worked together previously, whilst others had only known one legacy organisation, and where office spaces were being remodelled to facilitate more harmonised working, meant, according to one senior manager, the early months of the new probation service felt like being part of a dysfunctional family. This familiar concept of probation was something we encountered in our earlier study, in which the organisational separation of probation was described in terms of an unwanted divorce. Becoming defines both what has in common with one's own in-group and also what differentiates oneself from others, and thereby renders the concept a critical element in the site of identity politics. The majority of former CRC staff interviewed felt that the narrative of a failed CRC had become a normalised part of everyday discourses, which in turn impacted upon their sense of professional esteem, as reflected in these quotes from Eric, Esme and Valerie. A year down the line, we're now in that post-unification phase, and there is a culture clash, and you can see it daily. It's nothing nasty, and it's not an horrendous culture clash, but there is, for me, from a CRC point of view, MPS good, CRC bad, an assumption that MPS delivered good, solid risk management, and the CRC weren't good at that. According to Esme, it was the simple things like your lanyard. At the point of unification, obviously, you couldn't have anything with CRC on it. I think it was a dirty word at that point. All the legacy CRC staff got new lanyards, and they weren't great, and they just kept falling off. The legacy MPS staff all had their own National Probation Service lanyards, so they kept them. I know it's something quite simple, but that is still an identity and a badge, what organisation you previously worked for. The symbolism of the lanyard and the logo is interesting here, and its significance in terms of the individual's self-identity. As has been noted, probation has never really had the same symbolic power of other criminal justice organisations. As an aside, If you go onto Google and you put in probation artifacts, this is what you get. Now, the first two are taken from a brilliant Sheffield Hallam initiative by Andrew Fowler and Tom Brown that explores what objects tell us about probation workers' personal histories, their time of probation, and what they tell us about the identity of probation work. And of those two images, the first is the lanyard referred to by the participants in our study. The second, the coffee cup, is interesting. It reminded me very much of Curtin McWilliams' survey of staff following TR, and how the labelling of tea and coffee supplies became symbolic in the stories of separation and the damage caused by the split. However, looking at the rest of the images, although there might be a number of relics associated with probation, and I probably count myself as one of them now, I'm not sure the pickaxe and the stake were ever part of the probation toolkit. A feature of our stories of becoming, recounted by those interviewed, was a feeling many had that the occupational culture of the service has been eroded by the relentless nature of the workload demands placed upon staff at all levels. Many respondents reported regularly working late at night and on weekends, which is having a negative effect on their work-life balances. This spillover of probation working practitioners' family lives is, of course, not a new phenomenon by any means, and has been well documented by Challen Westerby, Jake Phillips, and Andrew Fowler in their study around TR. Feelings of stress over work anxiety were recurring themes in our interviews, with interviewees openly discussing the impact on their mental health and their well-being, as captured in the following quote from Beverly. And I should have said, these aren't their real names, by the way. "I couldn't work those long hours anymore. Nobody asked me to work these long hours, but the majority of both probation staff are caring and conscientious. With that volume of high cases that you've got and the work that needs doing, and all the changes that came with it at once, it was too overwhelming. It just wasn't manageable." The volatility created by colleagues' absences through sickness and stress meant teams routinely had to adapt, move cases around, and make extensive shifts in operational capacity in ways that added to a cumulative sense of unmanageability, as expressed by Ian, the SPO here. It's so tense at the moment, it's really at breaking point. The ripple effect in an office where you've got 15 POs. If 2 resign because they can get a better job with less stress elsewhere, and then you relocate the caseload. Then 2 go off sick because they've got too much workload. All of a sudden, you've got 10 POs for 15 POs where things don't get done, jobs start piling up. It's just insane. That feels like where we are at the moment. It's just a very hard-pressed public service. The need for improving salary and pay scales was a powerful feature in a number of our interviews and added to this sense of not being valued, as reflected in the following quote from Grace. "I've been at the top of my band for over 20 years now, so I've been getting poorer and poorer. To be in a professional job and not being able to be in a position to pay your bills and keep everything paid that you need to pay for, and not having any disposable income, that's disappointing." In over a quarter of our interviews, respondents compared their pay and conditions unfavourably with other sectors, including retail, roles which they perceived as carrying far less levels of risk and responsibility. Many respondents explicitly cited this as the reason why they, or a close colleague, were considering their future within the organisation. Their sense of commitment and loyalty to the role has been further tested by what some saw as an overbearing pressure to manage risk, coupled with the fear of being exposed if people then they supervised committed a serious further offence. This was heightened by the negative national publicity following the commission of serious further offences by those under supervision, which hit the news just as the research was progressing. The impact of this, I think, can be felt in Jane's statement that the SFO process, everyone is terrified of it, you know? Will I be hung out to dry? Am I going to be the scapegoat if someone kills somebody? Probation is perceived by other views as being somewhat powerless in its response and to defend criticisms of its work. A dominant theme that came through in our interviews was the feeling that probation work is unacknowledged and misunderstood by the public. This was compounded by what was perceived to be a lack of a dominant voice for probation, in national debates, and a perception that the most dominant voices in HMPPS were those from the prison service. As one senior manager remarked to me recently, there's two P's in HMPPS, one large P, prison, and one small p, probation. One HMPPS as well, emerging as it did during our interviews, seemed to cast a further shadow and further reinforce this view. Another aspect of becoming is how you are socialised into the organisation. And again, you can't see it, but this is stories of becoming in terms of new entrants. And some of those interviewed highlighted the challenges facing newer staff within the organisation. For more experienced staff with a service history that predated TR, they recalled the period in probation's history when the pressures did not seem as relentless. They also had the counterpoint to the present and their own more positive learning and mentoring relationships that have been so crucial in their own professional development. They were concerned that their new colleagues and those undertaking the PQIP programme, that's the probation qualification and probation, in particular, were not benefiting from such conditions. This was compounded by the sheer numbers of those in training, resulting from the commitment to recruit 2,500 training probation officers between 2020 and 2022 to support the value of the target operating model. On occasion, the influx of trainees into the organisation is viewed more as of a burden by some, rather than providing relief to the existing workforce. As reflected in the statement by Olivia, that we all really want these new staff to do well, but you're also mindful that you're only giving them 50% of what they need because you're so busy yourself. The comment by Amy was typical of concerns expressed frequently about the robustness of the training and mentoring arrangements recent and current PQIP trainees these services have received. As Amy says, with the best will in the world, from all that I've seen, that training programme is not as effective as the one we did. There isn't the intensity, there isn't the exposure, there isn't the support, there isn't the face-to-face contact enough for training. It does feel like the quality of the staff that come out now aren't necessarily where you'd like them to see them at that point. I do think there's been a kind of dumbing down of the training, really. Across a number of offices, in ways consistent with Jane Dominey and her colleagues' research, staff reported struggling not only in terms of having to work remotely, but also in terms of providing formal and informal mentoring opportunities for PQIP. Some worry about how quickly those new to the organisation were moving into full caseloads and complex case management, and of the potential impacts on long-term retention of new qualified staff. As reflected in Mary's statement, that for PQIPs, it's at least 6 months before you see any payback. And I know it sounds transactional, but the learners need to be really steady entry in. They need to be supported, and it takes a lot of support. But because we are where we're at, we're pulling back from some of the things we've offered previously, such as the mentoring arrangements, etc., etc. My fear is that we may get a group coming in very positive, engaged, real sense of vocation and want to do this work. But how quickly will they be battered down because of what's coming into, because of what they're coming into? And how resilient will they be? While the recruitment of staff to fill vacancies and the investments of funding to support this was viewed as necessary, important, and welcome, respondents consistently highlighted stories of where colleagues had taken time away from work through sickness and of early career practitioners who were leaving the organisation because they felt that the reality of the role was very different from their expectations. This reinforced for many in our sample concerns about retention and the need to do more on working conditions for those in probation, which was seen as just as important as the initial recruitment. Interestingly, in our second sweep of interviews, certainly from a personal level, those I've interviewed, the focus seems to have centred less on PQIP staff and more on the support and development for the PSO grade who've been employed to replace those who've gone onto the training. Whilst the recruitment of PSOs has been seen as an opportunity to widen the diversity of the workforce, concerns have also been expressed about the retention of this group also. Again, stories were recounted of individuals who left the organisation shortly after they'd been appointed, either because the job wasn't what they expected it to be, or their perception to being poorly supported and developed. Another interesting aspect of becoming and subsequent then belonging in the recent second round of interviews we're currently conducting is around the question of what is it that staff actually see themselves becoming? Previous studies of probation culture have pointed to a continuation of the probation ethos among probation practitioners, as I will discuss later. Linked to this idea of becoming what is the sense of what do we belong to? Belonging is more than just an individual feeling. It can have both an emotional component of feeling at home or yearning for a home, and a political element of claim making for space and recognition. In his study of probation staff following the TR reforms, Matt Tidmarsh found that probation practitioners tend to identify more with probation as a profession rather than the organisation within which it was located. And that a commitment to offender-centric ideology of service endured throughout organisational change. In our previous study, Matthew, Gwen and myself argued that the cleavages within probation caused by TR may have stretched the resilience of a durable occupational probation culture, one that was identified, located within this notion of a ideology of service, but it was nevertheless still there. Similarly, those interviewed in our current study routinely expressed a strong sense of duty of care, both to the people they supervised and the colleagues they worked alongside, as reflected in the quote by Becky here. I mean, the heart is there, as cheesy as that sounds. I think if you work here, you're not here for the money, are you? Staff are here for the right reasons. And that's the foundation that you need. The people here, they want to help people, and that's what we do. The resolve expressed by many probation staff to persist, despite the considerable day-to-day challenges, emerged even more strongly when we asked respondents to rate how loyal they felt to the service, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the highest. 72% of those interviewed scored 7 or above, with the mean score for the sample of around 7.4. The below views were not uncommon. I'm really proud of working for Probation Service. I would be proud if I was a probation officer, if I was an SPO, and I'm proud of where I am now. I do feel really loyal to it. Like the Guardians we observed in our earlier study, many respondents framed their sense of loyalty in terms of an enduring commitment to probation, as what Anne Worrell in her McWilliams Lecture a few years ago termed an honourable profession, and the values that underpin such work. If you look at Diane here, who says, you know that whatever you do in your day, no matter what role you're in, is contributing to making things better for the most vulnerable in society. Why wouldn't you want to do that? Why wouldn't you want to help those who are less advantaged than yourself? That's what I'm loyal to. And Ian's words that my loyalty lies to the colleagues, to my colleagues and my staff, and the legacy of what my probation roots were. My loyalty lies to those offenders who are in the community, who are part of a bigger system and are trying to move forward with their lives. The enduring sense of optimism and loyalty presented by respondents may appear somewhat paradoxical in the face of the challenges they were experiencing. On one level, it may be reflective of the need to find positives in such difficult circumstances in order to cope with the immediate challenges they faced. However, on a deeper level, it might also be indicative of how individuals draw on their own agency and values to keep going in the face of adversity. Like many previous studies, we did not find any real evidence of a new breed of probation officers emerging in the period immediately following unification. However, in our second round of interviews, there were signs, and again, I have to be careful here because we have not yet fully transcribed and analysed the data yet, that as experienced staff were leaving the organisation and being replaced by those whose relationship with the organisation seemed to be much more transitional, even though their motivation to join seemed to align with traditional probation values. More of what Gwen, Matthew and myself defined as pragmatists in our earlier study. The notion of frontline supervision was something you did for maybe a few years before either moving into a specialism, advancing within the organisation or leaving from another organisation was something which is more prevalent in our second round of interviews. But in some respects, this might merely be reflective of broader societal attitudes towards employment. and also its precariousness. It also seems likely, though, that the lifers identified by Anne Waddell and Rob Morby in their classic study of probation occupational cultures are likely to become much fewer in future. And of course, this could be really significant given the sheer size of the newly recruited staff into the service. Thinking of my own experience of joining probation, in the office there would be 1 or 2 of us in training, and the rest of the staff group would be different degrees of more experience. And so they help you to learn your craft, to develop your own place within the organisation. Now, when you join probation, the chances are that you'll be in a centre where you'll be based generally, that will generally be staffed by people, many of whom will be like yourself and at the same stage in the organisation. What this means for the dynamics of socialisation and what a probation ethos looks like as a potential consequences, as the consequences of this unfold over the coming years, I think will be very interesting. I know it's a point which Amy's going to pick up a little bit later. We also explored notions of belonging and self-identity in more depth in our second round of interviews by asking those we interview to rank according to whom they most identify with at the local, regional, and national levels. Again, although we're still analysing the data, some tentative themes are emerging, with the exception of those with region-wide responsibilities who you might expect will have a more of a regional focus. Most practitioners do not see themselves as part of a region, HMPPS, or necessarily civil servants, although they believe that the increased bureaucracy and performance management they were experiencing were directly linked to this. What was most important for them is what happens at the local level. Now, perhaps we shouldn't be surprised by this, as Gwen Robinson, Peter Halsall, and Mark Nixon pointed out in their contribution to a recent book edited by myself and others entitled Reimagining Probation Practice. Although probation is now organised on a regional basis, it continues to operate at the level of local probation delivery units. And it's within these settings and how they interact with other key agents and organisations in their locale that the public face of probation is represented and played out. So you'll be glad to hear, to conclude that. An overriding view captured in our first week of research interviews with practitioners in our case study region was that unification was a necessary but painful process for the service and those working within it. This is actually the title of the first article published by the research team in Probation Journal, which will in coming days be available online and be accessed free of charge. The challenging pace, direction, experience and consequences of the latest organisational changes affecting probation, namely its unification, were generally experienced as turbulent and unsettling. It's therefore perhaps unsurprising that our respondents found the situation challenging, although some of those interviewed were able to see opportunities as well as threats in terms of the future development of the service. As one PO put it, I do think that years down the line, we'll look back and say, God, what did we live through? How did we get back to this point? The issues and concerns I've outlined today, as I say, are no means unique to our case study area. HMI Probation has stated that nationally, probation continues to be an organisation that's struggling with major staffing issues, with undertrained officials coping with unmanageable workloads. In this respect, I think our findings support the assertion by Gwen Robinson that probation is a sector undergoing a necessary, lengthy and complex process of restructuring, but that it does so as a post-traumatic organisation, still contending with the harms of the hasty implementation and subsequent systematic flaws of the Transforming Rehabilitation reform programme, as well, of course, as a global pandemic. The post-CRC MPS dynamics that we presented here suggest that a year on from unification, much work was still needed to build an inclusive culture and to repair the damage caused by TR. It should be acknowledged, though, that these first round of interviews took place at a particularly challenging point in the change process. There are signs, though, from our second round of interviews with practitioners that probation is moving tentatively towards a more stabilised state in our case study region, at least it would seem. And certainly the language of legacy organisations that seem to symbolise the fractures in the service at that time has thankfully been far less evident in our most recent interviews. In a brilliant McWilliams lecture last year, Gwen Robertson asked the question, can probation be rehabilitated? Well, 2 years down the line, it would appear that like many rehabilitative journeys, there's been some progress, setbacks, and a few turns along the way. On a deeper level, as I've mentioned, probation is being potentially transformed by the large number of staff entering the organisation, whose organisational memories do not predate TR and the subsequent unification of probation. It remains to be seen how this will affect probation over the coming years, but the extent to which those responsible are able to knit and renew organisational working cultures within the unified service will undoubtedly be crucial in determining whether or not the aspirations for the reform programme are ultimately achieved. As Matt Tidmarsh and Ian Marder note, probation practice is at its best when delivered by reflexive, emotionally literate practitioners guided by explicit values that inform ethical decision-making. As Rob Canson has written, values represent more than moral beliefs which people bring to their work. They emerge and develop from the experience of dealing with morally complex situations. Bill McWilliams, I'm sure, would endorse this and call for these values to be put into action. Probation workers experience firsthand and on a daily basis the impact of structural disadvantage faced by those they come into contact with in their work. Unless probation listens to and subsequently advocates for those whose daily existence is framed by harsh and often unjust government policies, then it becomes all too easy to drift into sterile and ultimately futile debates that fuel expectations of what probation can realistically achieve and ignites the blame culture that masks structural failings behind individual actions. I accept that speaking out in this way may have become more challenging than a civil service framework, but ultimately, to quote Fergus MacNeill, probation should be part of a societal commitment that helps us figure out how we live together rather than keeping us apart. All too often, the voices of practitioners have been ignored in past policy discourses. And some of those interviewed in our study believe that this continues to be the case. Probation workers grapple with constantly changing work parameters and are embedded in an occupational culture that seems to create feelings of being disrespected and undervalued, specifically in having their own experiences acknowledged. My talk today and the research upon which is drawn is in this respect a modest attempt to redress this balance. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you so much for your entirely stimulating and thought-provoking lecture. Many of you, I'm sure, will have questions and reflections, but I'm asking you, if you would please, to keep hold of those, because first I want to give an opportunity for the respondents we've invited to reply to you, Noel. The first of our respondents is Anne Burrell. Now, Anne is an experienced probation officer and senior probation officer, and she has experience of working both, or before that, for a trust, but then more recently, both in the NPS and in the CRC, so has seen a lot of this and now works for the reunited Probation Service as a practice teacher assessor. She's a director of the Probation Institute. And in recent years, she has become a prolific writer from a very small, I don't think she'd published much before at all, but is now churning out articles of high quality, quickly, including a chapter in the book that Lol referred to about reimagining probation practice. I've had the pleasure of coming to know Anne because although I'm retired from the university, Anne is working for her PhD. I'm still part of the supervision team. And it's interesting how COVID has made its difference and remote contact. It's made a difference to universities as well, of course, as you can imagine. So I feel that Anne is an old friend, and she reminded me today that this is, what, the second or maybe the third time we've ever actually met, that even though we've often stared at each other on screens. And I can tell you that Anne is a pleasure to work with, wholly positive and an optimistic person who has dealt with enormous patience with many of the difficulties that have arisen in conducting fieldwork and in the fun process of seeking ethical approval from HMPPS. So, Anne, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And first of all, thank you very much to Rob for that very warm welcome. And I am blushing internally, if not externally. I very much appreciate being invited to respond to Laurel's really eloquent presentation. And I feel very honoured and also daunted to be addressing the pantheon of deities of probation here in the room today. And I know there are others online too, so thank you. What I would like to do is spend a while thinking about some of the points made by Laurel, and alongside that to venture into some personal considerations which have emerged whilst thinking about the Liverpool John Moores research study led by Laurel and his colleagues, and which relies on experiences of transforming rehabilitation and of reintegration of the Probation Service of England and Wales. My perspective is a study researching the unification of probation services is clearly both pertinent as well as timely. It's my view that the findings of the project and the analysis of the data will have long-term relevance, not solely for probation, but for other public sector services too. The significance of issues relating to the structures and cultures of organisations appear to be relevant to policy decision-making in health services and in education, as much as in the criminal justice sector. In that regard, the study is a landmark, and it feels a privilege to hear firsthand of the research work being undertaken. Laurel outlined the key concerns and challenges for the newish probation service. These include its organisational culture, the issue of practitioner professional identity, which I would regard as inextricably linked to professional confidence, and which you alluded to, Laurel, and the perceived legitimacy of current probation practice, which you also referred to at length. And Laurel's pointed out the impact of recent His Majesty's Inspectorate reports into horrendous serious further offences, and what appears to be a subsequent loss of confidence in probation work by the Inspectorate, the judiciary and the public. I don't think anyone attending this lecture, nor indeed any probation employee, isn't acutely aware that when we get things wrong, the consequences for others can be catastrophically harmful, and that probation practitioners have an overarching duty to remain vigilant and attentive to the priority of keeping people safe. Equally, the effective and positive practice in much probation work is little known about, for very sound reasons, but therefore little recognised. It therefore seems important to me to emphasise the study's focus on the perceived legitimacy of current probation practice. And I'm also particularly interested in the insights into the hopes and fears of practitioners at a time when the attrition of staff remains a key risk factor for the effective delivery of probation. And finally, the impact of transforming rehabilitation and the current unification process on practitioner emotional well-being. Long's described that a key factor in the research project is that consideration of how the probation service seeks to rebuild the confidence of probation staff in their role and the reconstruction of the legitimacy of probation work amongst stakeholders in probation. A common theme in both contexts seems to be the formation and maintenance of constructive and positive relationships, both within the probation service itself, between colleagues and teams, and with partner agencies. Thinking particularly about the immediate aftermath of TR, and Laurel has alluded to this, one dispiriting and sad consequence was the divisiveness which swiftly developed between groups of colleagues who had, until shortly before, worked constructively in single delivery units, collaborating on their practice and providing mutual support. In the run-up to TR, most teams spent a period of purdah, remaining in shared buildings, whilst moving into different organisations and to different employers. The speed and gravity of the emotional divide was shocking to observe and to experience. A particularly evocative and poignant observation was made in the report of a study undertaken in 2015 by Jill Curtin from the University of London, with her account that, quote, everyday signs of the split included separate stationery cupboards, separate fridges, all the way down to separate tea bags. Whilst research participants laughed about these trivial symbols of the split, they also identified serious consequences of the separation of function and tasks for service delivery, and by extension for their own professional ethics. It's not surprising that one of the participants in the Rehabilitating Probation Research Project describes this process as a collective trauma. And of course, prior to TR, practitioners and teams were part of a network of relationships within their trusts and with stakeholders, such as other public protection agencies, the local magistrates and judiciary, and local communities. The Inspectorate of Probation has, on a number of occasions, notably in its reports into serious further offences, drawn attention to the diminution of the credibility of probation work during the TR period. And relatedly, Lol also drew attention to what he described as the evolving working relationships in the probation service. Writing in 2016, Dave Ward and the late Paul Senior, in collaboration with a number of academics from probation backgrounds, several of whom I know are here today, either in person or online, revisited the earlier work of the Kendall Group to seek to identify what they described as the essence of probation. And I'm grateful to Jane Dominy for drawing my attention to this paper. The authors noted that probation has always operated in a zone of uncertainty, specifically with regard to sentencing, when sentences may feel obliged to do something, but are uncertain about what action to take, and to harbour doubts about the possible outcomes. The authors helpfully outline the perspective that probation work doesn't operate solely in the criminal justice system, what the paper refers to as the correctional system, but also in relationship with systems of social welfare and of treatment and in communities. The model which the authors produced integrated all four systems, and in their conclusions identified the core task of probation work as being to support and enable people subject to its supervision via co-relational production with organisations and individuals located in these varied systems. They concluded that, quote, probation seems to suffer from a sense of liminality, unsure of its purpose, beholden to the institutions which it serves, and vulnerable to ideologically driven reform. A pertinent, if painfully accurate observation, which presents the dilemma: what is probation for and what are its purposes? In this context, I've recently read a wise and inspiring book by Rob Canton, which Lola also referred to, in which Rob looks at the wider issue of punishment, its purposes, significance and meanings, and how punishment is implemented. In this consideration of how societies address wrongdoing, indeed what is defined as wrongdoing in the first place, Rob argues that punishment inevitably means the degradation of dignity for those subjected to it, notably for prisoners, but also on what he describes as the pains of community sanctions and measures, making the point that the status of being a person on probation is experienced all the time, not solely when reporting to the probation office. But the book also draws attention to the positive aspects of probation supervision, returning to the now well-evidenced theme of the significance of the one-to-one relationship between probation practitioner and supervisee. A report into the lived experiences of people on probation produced by Revolving Doors in 2021 identified the factors which appeared most valuable to people on probation, including consistency, reliability, and genuine interest in the individual. One participant is quoted as saying that it's helped that my probation workers stuck with me, they weren't going to give up on me and put structures into place. It also helped that they were real, upfront and honest with me, and that they helped me access the support workers and medication I needed. More worryingly, the same study recorded that people on probation were often fearful and anxious about their contact with probation, identifying that the organisational focus on risk encouraged too speedy enforcement processes with insufficient attention to the context for non-compliance or lapse. Some of the practitioner responses in the Rehabilitating Project Probation Research Project suggest the reasons for these approaches, including overwork and fear of culpability if things go wrong. These conflicting aspects of probation work arguably reflect a wider shift away from rehabilitation and reintegration in favour of punitiveness, constraint, and othering. And this dichotomy is one which is being played out in the current context for probation work, compounded by the issue of significant staff attrition. In this context, and Lol helpfully provided some statistics, it's worth pointing out that the most recent HMPPS staffing figures for probation are indicative of positive increases in recruitment to the peak probation officers training. But the departures from the service also remain high. The issue of the appropriateness of current probation officer training, as highlighted by one of the respondents in the Rehabilitating Probation study, seem extremely linked to perhaps the most significant challenge of the probation service currently, and that's that of retention of practitioners over time. So what does all this mean for the probation service in England and Wales, and specifically at this time of further organisational change? We can recognise that the probation service appears to have moved a long way from its early imperative of the saving of souls via the means of advising, assisting and befriending. And writing in 1987, Bill McWilliams himself observed that in recent years, it's become impossible to understand the service other than as an instrument of government policy. And relatedly, it's been argued, for instance, by Harry Anderson and Gwen Robinson, that TR was the outcome of a specific perspective which reified the positive benefits of outsourcing, regardless of the evidence suggesting otherwise. In this context, the Rehabilitating Probation Project seeks to utilise what the research team have described as a unique opportunity to understand how public services adapt when outsourcing policies fail, and how individual and organisational identities are rebuilt after major organisational change. The recent publication edited by Lol and other colleagues, which he alluded to, entitled Reimagining Probation Practice, Reforming Rehabilitation in an Age of Penal Excess, sought to provide what the front piece described as a comprehensive and positive reimagining of probation practice in England and Wales. Each of the 11 subject specialist chapters discuss specific areas of probation work. Echoing the earlier work of the Kendall Group, the authors argued that there are 4 forms or spheres for effective rehabilitation, of which personal rehabilitation via probation practice is just one facet. Connected to personal rehabilitation is social rehabilitation, the reintegration of the individual into their social context, and the recovery of their social status. Moral rehabilitation relating to the legitimacy of probation work and the moral engagement of the individual subject to supervision. And finally, legal rehabilitation, which is described as the requalification of individuals as citizens. The book closes with a conclusion from the editors in which they observe that despite the challenges to the humanitarian and rehabilitative basis of its practice, probation has proved incredibly resilient over the years, even if its organisational structures and responsibilities have been constantly redirected by the political and ideological priorities of the neoliberal age. The intellectual commitment and desire by the probation community to reimagine better, more effective ways of helping individuals to desist from crime and to complete their rehabilitative journeys still burn bright. And I note that participants in the Rehabilitating Probation study, despite the sense of loss and dislocation engendered by the organisational changes of the last decade, continue to have pride in their work, to feel that the service retains what one respondent described as its heart, and that loyalty remains a key motivation for practitioners. In the conclusion to Reimagining Probation Practice, Lol and his colleagues conclude by asserting that Humanitarian approaches that implicitly reflect the moral basis of probation work are evidentially likely to be more effective in reducing reoffending, protecting the public, and ultimately bringing communities together to build the common good. So, on those notes of optimism and in conclusion, I'm very much looking forward to learning more about the findings of the research project so eloquently discussed by Lol. And I anticipate, and I can see from what you said, that the process of the research, as well as its outcomes, will continue to support and sustain probation workers as they navigate their way through the service's progress towards unification. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. And as before, I'm sure Anne's put a number of other thoughts and reflections into your minds, but if you could hold on to those, because I want first to hear from our other respondent, who is Amy Thornton. Now, Amy is head of public protection in West Midlands region, and she has a large and demanding and extremely complex portfolio, as it looks to me. She leads on MAPA, the region, safeguarding and domestic abuse, counter-terror, serious organised crime, recall and parole. What do you do in the rest of the time? Foreign national offenders, and sits on the National Security Group. Amy's worked in probation since 2007. She's a graduate of the University of Cambridge in penology. And one of the things that Amy's told me is that she's keen to celebrate and replicate the successes of probation, and particularly working perhaps in public protection. Probation only really gets heard of when it doesn't, when things go badly wrong. But all the time, probation is keeping people safer, and more needs to be said and understood about that. I've said that my two earlier speakers have been friends. I feel I've known them for a long time. Amy and I are also very old friends. We've known each other for nearly 3 hours. Yeah. And meeting for the first time today. But when your name was mentioned, Amy, as a potential respondent here, immediately a few people chimed in and said, "Oh, I've heard Amy. She's eloquent, clear, cogent, and I think she would make an excellent respondent." So, Amy, may I invite you please to take the floor?
Thank you. I'm not going to ruin the idea of being eloquent, but I shall try. So, hello everybody, my name is Amy Thornton, and I'm a civil servant. That might sound like the beginning of some type of step plan for some addiction, and it may very well be. It might be something that I have to consider. But I do need to be able to make that clear for my position with HMPPS. And it's one of the things that I consider and actually fear, Lol, when you were talking today, is, am I the noise that everyone complains about? Is that me? The longer that I've stayed in the probation service, and for as I've progressed in the leadership team, you become more and more aware of the necessity to count things, talk about things, own things, tell people how good we're doing, how bad we're doing. And that becomes tremendously difficult. It is so hard to count good. It's really hard to quantify that. And especially in probation, because quite honestly, good, nothing happens. Nobody's harmed. People have gone on to live, hopefully, quite normal, quite boring lives. And that's hard to count. But as I kind of go, the pressure, the necessity for us to kind of talk about managerialism in probation is one of my fears that, again, I'm turning into this noise. And it's one of the reasons that I was so honoured to be able to come today. Because when I do have those fears, it is the McWilliams papers that reminds me, there's a bit of a conscience here somewhere, of the papers, of the understanding of the value of probation and what we can bring, and making sure we're not just counting beans. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about today in responding to Lol's eloquent presentation earlier was around some of the changes that have happened. And now we've come to this target operating model in Probation Service England and Wales, fantastic name. We've got to a position where our target operating model is about empowerment. You Google and you go on gov.com, it will tell you that we are based in probation, HMPPS, It will quote Ferguson Neil. It will talk about desistance. This is a position I don't think necessarily we've been in before. But that's what it says. And sometimes we feel that the disconnect in between what it says and what it does. So I think we're having this, I think, quite positive future thinking model going forward about empowerment and desistance in an ever-increasing landscape of legislative changes. We now have the power to detain, we have parole changes, and then they've changed it again, then they've changed it again. All these different cacophony of pressures upon us to do probation work in the way that somebody wants us to do it. And those people that want us to do it are varied. They change between geography, between political ideation, between organisation. So where do we fit? Are we our own identity that commands this, that commands the control over what we are producing? Or are we so influenced by others that our identity becomes watered down? When I was thinking about the identity of probation and understanding some of the things that Lol was going to touch about today, it's where I started thinking about probation values. And I love that we don't give up. I love that our probation values seem to have stayed stronger than how many organisations have we been since we've probably been around? Many. But I think, you know, as Morby and Worrell will say, as Lola's talked about today, as Matt Tidmarsh will talk about, those values of probation, the ideas that people can change, stay as our constant. But where we get some real differences, when I reflect here upon Stuart Collins's article, I think it was back in 2016, around the difference in between professional commitment and organisational commitment. And that absolutely strikes to me when we talk about your final diagram, Lol. What am I committed to? And as Matt would say, as Stuart Collins would say, in talking about unification and actually about transforming rehabilitation, what we find is that probation practitioners are committed to the profession. And our organisation can change, and it does, and it continues to. And what does on the back of that just make me laugh is a little. Every time I go to a lecture, we talk about the unprecedented changes in probation. And every time probation does something else that's even more of an unprecedented change. I don't know when we'll ever get to the point and we'll be able to talk about the stability of probation. It gives us something to talk about at least. But we have this identity, this commitment to our professionalisation, but not necessarily to our organisation. But is that to do with our changing organisation and our changing landscape? Or is that because, and I'm allowed to say this now because I'm over 40, I can hear the horror and the shock in the room, but is that because generationally we're different? If I weren't to look at probation, but were to look at other organisations, are there young people coming through? Are graduates coming through? Are they wedded to the organisation? Are they wedded to a job? Or are they wedded to a value? And I think I can see that with our PQuicks coming through, that they might want to be a probation officer at the minute, but really they want to help people. And if they do that through the probation service or the fire service or revolving doors, whatever organisation it might be, it's the value that they're committed to. It's the professionalism, the idea and the notions of that role, rather than being a probation officer, rather than being wedded to an organisation. So I don't doubt our multitude of changes has confused people and made us sign allegiance to something that varies over time, whether we believe with those changes or not. But I do think there's probably a generational difference in people coming through and labour market differences, all manner of changes that will impact on our commitment to probation. And then the last point, I shan't talk long, because I could. The last thing that I wanted to talk about was around that commitment. And thinking about the differences in probation. When I think of the values that we have, and I walk around our probation office in the West Midlands. You see Val and Amy. And some of the things that I talk about, and we talk about, you know, what we do today, what have we got to do, what have we got to achieve. And I can see the values, I can see the desire to do well, the desire to help people. But in doing of the doing, do people do what I need them to do in terms of our target operating model? Is our allegiance to being a probation officer or a probation practitioner, have we been wedded to an allegiance? Are we wedded to a role that no longer exists? Do the values that we have and the doing of the doing in giving intervention, in spending time with people? When I joined probation, I wanted to sit there and I used to go into my targets for effective change. And I do intervention one-to-one with people. I'm not asking probation officers to do that now. I'm asking probation officers to be risk assessors. I'm asking them to be brokers on a new target operating model, refer to community rehabilitative services, to put people into structured interventions. We're getting more and more targeted cohorts. Does the role that people have that value base and that commitment to, is that role still here in 2023? I don't know. I would hope there'd be aspects of it to be there. And that's what I wanted to try and understand. And hopefully I would like to join others into having questions with us about talking about, are we where we could be, where we should be? And do our values still work with the expectations of our current organisation? So thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy.